All right. Good morning, folks. Welcome to another Wednesday webinar. My name is CJ Operthauser. I'm the Director of Training and Placemaking here at GrowSmart Rhode Island. And we have with us this lovely panel whose faces you can see and whose names you can also see and titles here on the screen. So today we're going to talk about the future of Aquidneck Island. We're going to hear a lot from Aquidneck Land Trust, Sasaki, and some leadership in Middletown with Ron. So before we get going, just gonna mention some things about the Power Play Summit. Obviously, we wish we could be with you all in person and in a room together talking about this, but we're really glad to have this kind of online format because I think it opens up a lot of access as far as either availability or even just being able to attend multiple panels rather than just two like we do in person. And as far as attending these panels goes, we have one every single Wednesday, 10 a.m. Up until September, late September. And you can check out our full slate of panels, a kind of a menu on our website. So head there, you can check out everything that you might be able to sign up for. If you do have a summit ticket, all of these are included. If you don't, it's $10 a piece, so you can kind of pick and choose if there's just a couple that grab your attention. So we'll have these every Wednesday up into September 25th, and on that day we're going to have kind of a half-day plenary, also virtual, and it's going to feature Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, along with award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and Brookings Institution. And we're going to have a few other panels and discussions and speakers to flesh out the half-day panel, and our awards program will be part of that day as well. So stay tuned for more details on that, and we hope you'll join us for it. I want to say thank you to our sponsors listed right here. Obviously, we couldn't do this without them. Very grateful to these folks. You can find out more information on both our panelists right here. We have full bios on our website, as well as all the other panelists that we have as part of these Wednesday webinars. So you can head there and check out more information about these folks. All of our webinars are approved for one AICP credit for all you planners out there seeking those. So you can log all that on the AICP website and find out more information about how to do that. As far as questions go today, we're going to let these guys do their panel, and we're going to do Q&A when they're all done. But you can send in a question at any time when it occurs to you, and I'll mark it so that you know we'll get to it, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end to get there. And we should be all done by about 11:15, but a little bit flexible on that. And regardless, if you have to leave or you're late, we're going to have a recorded version of this available to everybody shortly after we're done. So you can watch this with popcorn at your home as many times as your heart desires. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Chuck to introduce today's panel.
Thank you, CJ. Welcome all to our webinar on the future of Aquidneck Island. Will it run out of space by 2050? In looking at the group of people who are attending, it seems that there are some people interested in the results of our development impact assessments. And then I think there are other people who are probably interested in kind of our takeaways from doing this process of creating these plans and how it would work in other communities. So we think that our outline covers both of those aspects. Aquidneck Island is just about 38 square miles and has a population of 60,000 with a much larger population in the summer. As most communities in Rhode Island, it has a declining population. Yet unlike much of the state, despite that flat population, it is still experiencing significant development growth. This is a map that's it's located in a pub in Middletown, and I had to go over and get a copy of it yesterday. But it's a great map of Aquidneck Island from the 1960s. I apologize for the reflections, but I think it still gives you a good idea of how much Aquidneck Island has changed over that period of time. Middletown and Portsmouth were effectively mostly farmland back in the 60s, and that is so different today. So I think both the Aquidneck Land Trust and the town of Middletown are, quite concerned about keeping an appropriate balance of built and unbuilt environments so that we can keep a high quality of life on the island. And I think for different reasons, but with that kind of as a backdrop, both the town of Middletown and the Land Trust in 2019 did development impact assessments. And while it might seem at first blush like that is a kind of a wasteful duplication of effort, it helped us to really cross-check each of our plans, which you don't always have that ability to do that. But it was amazing how similar the results of the two plans, even though, as you'll hear later, they kind of came from different methodologies and different reasons for coming together. So the panel today is myself. I am the executive director of the Aquidneck Land Trust. Jill Allen Dixon is associate principal at Sasaki Associates. And I have worked with Jill on a number of different projects, and with Sasaki, they helped us also do an open space master plan in Newport. Ron Wolanski is the planning director for the town of Middletown and has been there since early 2000s, right, Ron? And last is Alex Schumann, who is the stewardship director at ALT. He is our on the ground person. So when you look at all this map, Alex knows every one of these properties. He is very well versed in the land resources on Aquidneck Island. So where I'd like to start is, let's talk about the reasons why each of us did a development impact analysis. Alex, you want to talk about why ALT did it in the first place?
Yeah, so ALT's been quite successful over the years. We've been able to protect 2,600 acres over the last 30 years or so. But we came to the realization that our conservation efforts just were not keeping up with the intense development pressure on Aquidneck Island, particularly the last few years. So our board was frequently discussing, questions like, well, how long do we have until we don't have any more open space left on Aquidneck Island other than what we've already worked on? And led by a few really passionate board members, that sort of led us to the idea where we need a really formal, objective analysis by a highly qualified consultant to answer those questions. And really with three audiences in mind. One was for donors, making the case, hey, we really need to ramp up our conservation efforts before it's too late. We only have so many years left. The other was just for general population Aquidneck Islanders who might need some data, want to learn more, to be able to advocate for land use policies and conservation on the island in the different towns. And the third was for the municipalities themselves, the town councils, the planning boards, zoning boards, giving them another source of data to, support changes to ordinances or that sort of thing that encourage conservation. So that's really where we started from. And led us to Sasaki and Jill's team there.
And with the towns also for them to help fund our open space acquisitions, because the towns of especially Middletown and Portsmouth have been visionary partners in protecting open space, but they need the compelling story. So Ron, talk about why the town of Middletown decided to do a development impact assessment.
Well, similar concerns, Chuck, as you mentioned, population is declining. However, we do still see development occurring. And as the economy had improved over the past several years, we've seen development pressures, residential development pressure, particularly on the east side of town, and also commercial development pressure. The planning board, seeing these applications coming in, wanted to get a feel for where this was all going and what the potential was what the potential is in the town for future development and build out. So it's to get a snapshot of what we would be looking at full build out, looking at alternative scenarios. The idea being that whatever comes out of the study would be useful as the planning board works towards revising the comprehensive plan. We're 5 years into our comp plan now, so we'll be starting to think about our next comp plan, and this will be helpful as we draft that. And then implementing policies that get adopted in the comp plan through regulatory revisions, through zoning and land use regulations. We're talk about this later too, but we're not quite done with this process yet. We've completed the build out analysis, but we haven't yet had the discussion of where do we go next with the results and some of the recommendations that we've seen.
So you have been held up, as we have been, because of the pandemic, in kind of really rolling out your plan. You have rolled it out to the planning board, is that correct?
That's right. We have presented the study, the report to the planning board in pretty good detail. We are scheduled now to present at least a highlights version of the presentation to the town council at one of their meetings in September. So we'll finally, after this was, I believe, finalized in March, finally have an opportunity to present it to the broader public through that town council presentation.
Great. So let's dig in. Ron, can you just give us an overview of the methodology and findings of your development impact assessment?
Sure, I'm gonna start my screen share. Okay, so Chuck, I'm going to try to watch the clock, but feel free to nudge me if I get too long here.
Will do.
So as just mentioned, this was really initiated by the planning board. We worked with Crossman Engineering to conduct the study and prepare the report, again, issued in March of 2020. We just talked about the purpose of the report. The project scope, as I said, it's a full build-out analysis. What I didn't mention was that one of the things the planning board wanted to get in addition to the build-out is also the potential impacts on natural resources and also traffic. So there are evaluations of impacts on surface water, groundwater quality and quantity, as well as traffic impacts. I'm not going to be able to get too deeply into the results of those analyses today, but at the end of the presentation, there's a link to the full report. So in terms of methodology, again, we're starting with current zoning, doing a full build, but also we looked at 3 potential alternatives. One being potentially rezoning portions of the town to higher, or I should say lower density zoning, taking our R40 and R60 districts to R100. Looking at excluding marginal lots. So to explain that, for the full build out, we took land area and basically existing developed lots in the residential areas, if they had a house on it but were big enough to be subdivided, we counted those potential additional lots regardless of whether they might have the required street frontage. So again, that's sort of the worst case scenario, and understanding that in the past the planning board and the zoning board have issued relief to folks without the required frontage to allow building on those lots that have the required area but maybe not the required frontage. So again, that would be worst case. And then also looked at an alternative where we might exclude those areas in town that are within our watershed protection district zone 1, and I'll show you a map of those areas. This is a quick look at our future land use plan. The east side of town on the right is our residential areas, R60 and R40. lower density residential on the left side, the west side of town. There's a higher density residential as well as the commercial areas along West Main Road, East Main Road. Again, zoning R40 and R60 on the east side of town, higher density on the west side. This map shows our utilities, water and sewer infrastructure. The purple and blue are areas that have utilities. The beige area on the east side are areas that do not have water and sewer. So again, it's not surprising that in the low density areas, we don't have those utilities, which was a concern of the planning boards and one of the reasons that they wanted to look at the potential for development on the east side. This is the Zone 1 map. So in our watershed protection district, our town, substantial part of the town is watershed to the public drinking water supply for the Newport water system. The areas in blue are 200 feet from streams that feed into that public water supply, and the shaded areas, beige and red, are hydric soils. So those blue areas and the other shaded areas are the town's watershed protection district, Zone 1, that I mentioned, possibly, at least as an alternative to look at restricting or prohibiting development in those areas. So in the full bill determination, again, we looked at undeveloped land, but also developed residential lots that are oversized with potential for more development. We excluded wetlands, excluded conservation easements, and conserved lands. We did include land that is zoned open space but not protected. So for example, there's a golf course in town which is zoned open space, but it is not protected. So we counted that towards developable land. Our commercial areas, again, looked at undeveloped land on either vacant lots or lots that have additional development potential, excluded wetlands. No vertical reconfiguration, meaning that we basically looked at our existing footprints, but did not predict that those buildings might increase in height with additional stories being added. And then we also considered potential for mixed-use development on selected parcels. The town has adopted a mixed-use ordinance, which has been in place for about a year. In these percentages, 35% retail, 35% residential, and 30% office. Those are just a way of looking at the potential within those mixed-use parcels, and those were considered in the build-out. So I guess right down to the bottom line here, what we found in our build-out was the potential for up to 1,900 new residential units in town at full build. That's about a 25% increase over the current number of residential units. And given our, in Middletown, the residents per household of 2.2 or so, we're looking at about a 25% potential increase in population as well. This is just a graph showing where that development potential is. Existing dwelling units in blue, additional dwelling in red. You can see that in the R40 district, there's a pretty good potential for additional residential development. So looking at the alternative scenarios and what that resulted in. So again, on the left, we've got the full build at roughly 1,900 units. If you exclude those marginal lots, and again, taking out lots that might not be created if they don't have the required frontage, you lose maybe 200 lots. If you were to rezone the R40 and R60 districts to R100, you'd lose about 300 lots, or units, I should say. If you exclude development in the watershed protection district, you would lose, again, just under 300 potential lots. And I just want to, I guess, mention on a watershed protection district, as it stands right now, we have an ordinance which requires oversight and special use permit for development in watershed protection district 1, but it does not prohibit development. So just to make that clear. So this scenario would actually prohibit development within zone 1. When you combine all the alternatives together, if we were to implement all three, you might lose, up to around 700 lots. It's not additive because there is some overlap for example, some of the marginal lots might also be in zone 1, so you don't count those twice. So again, if all alternatives were to be adopted, maybe 700 lots or 700 units would be lost. For commercial development, there's potential for about 2.6 million square feet of additional commercial within our existing commercial zoned areas. The only alternative that applies would be that zone 1 alternative, where if development was prohibited, you might lose 500,000 or so square feet. So in terms of impacts, again, there's a lot more than the report that if you want to get into the detail, you certainly are welcome to look at it. Just as an overview though, we looked at several watersheds in town. Again, several of them are public water supply watersheds. In terms of existing versus build out conditions in terms of impervious coverage. Again, the red being new impervious, you can see significant increases in almost all of the watersheds. We've got lines here for 10% impervious being recognized impacted area, and then at 25% impervious is recognized to be a degraded watershed. Looking at, for example, the Maidford watershed, Paradise watershed, the Secaunet 1 watershed, which are all on the east side of town, you can see that having build out occur in those areas, you're pushing those over and above or close to the impacted line there, which is, I think, a concern. Those watersheds that are already well above the impacted areas, so there's still some additional impervious there, but they are the commercial, basically West Main Road area, commercial areas that are highly impacted already. And this is just a map, quick map showing through shading the increases in impervious over existing. And this is sort of obvious, I think, to many people. With the increase in impervious area, you're increasing runoff volumes, you're increasing pollutant loading. We did analyze or predict loading for phosphorus, nitrogen, suspended solids, fecal coliform, lead, and copper. All of those increase with impervious in development of those properties. The one thing that I'll mention, though, we did find that on the east side of town, land that is currently identified as agricultural, we in the modeling found a decrease in some of the nutrient loading as those properties get developed because of the use of fertilizers on those properties and the runoff from the agricultural land. Recommendations, this is coming out of the report. These are not necessarily recommendations coming from the planning board. These are things that are going to be discussed by the planning board with the town council in future discussions. But out of the report, there are recommendations including encouraging low impact development, promoting source reduction, establishing routine water quality testing, retrofitting existing water systems, evaluating feasibility of a stormwater utility, which the town has looked at and is continuing to look at. Chuck, I know I'm getting up against my time, but I'm gonna buzz through this. So groundwater resources, we looked at, the town is, it relies on bedrock, the bedrock aquifer, which we have a fairly thin layer of soil over bedrock, and most of the private water supply wells are bedrock wells. Impacts from development include decreased groundwater infiltration, increased number of domestic wells, increased septic systems. However, the overall groundwater budget from our analysis is that we retain a positive budget. There's plenty of water overall, but there are localized concerns where folks might have shallow wells. In terms of the recommendations, consider installing monitoring wells, encourage testing of private wells, consider enacting an on-site wastewater management ordinance. That one, again, is being reviewed and continuing to be discussed. Perform town-wide groundwater quality testing. I'll zip right through traffic here. We looked at 15 intersections, 12 of which, or 13, are signalized. 2 unsignalized intersections, did the analysis based on the potential full build, and found that, you know, not only do we have existing concerns, particularly on the west side of town, East Main Road, and the lower areas of West Main Road and the lower areas of East Main Road, with the new development, there's increased impacts from traffic. Sort of obvious, but we do have those numbers to actually quantify what those impacts would be. And that was done using this sort of a traffic shed analysis, where the engineer estimated the amount of traffic that would be generated by developments within these traffic sheds. This is a chart that's just indicating the substantial increase in traffic related to some commercial development, mixed-use development on the west side of town as well. Quick summary. So again, full build out, we found about 1,900 new units, 2.6 million square feet. Commercial, possible strategies, again, limiting marginal lots, increasing zoning, and then prohibiting development in zone 1 of the watershed protection district. For surface water, we found, again, there are already issues with degraded water quality in our streams. That only increases with the development. And groundwater, again, no major issues in terms of supply, but localized concerns because of the reliance on bedrock wells, where we might want to look at minimum lot sizes in those areas to ensure that well quantity and quality is preserved. And we recommend doing a minimum 500 foot deep wells in the bedrock. And traffic findings, some of the recommendations were to look at timing of signals, roadway lane width, turning lanes, and looking at roundabouts at appropriate intersections to improve traffic flow. As I discussed, next steps, presentation to the town council. I expect that there'll be some form of a subcommittee between the planning board and maybe council members that will do a deeper dive into the study and come up with recommendations and identify suggested policy changes to incorporate into the comp plan, and then look at regulatory adjustments that might be made, and whether those recommendations or those suggestions include any of the scenarios that were used during the build-out study. You know, that remains to be seen. But that conversation will start, I think, in September, and we'll see where that goes. And that's it. I'm done.
Thanks, Ron.
Sure.
Jill, can you kind of give us the methodologies and findings of the ALT Sasaki development impact assessment?
Sure thing, Chuck. So hi everyone, I'm Jill Dixon. I'm an associate principal with Sasaki. And so today I'll be talking through the methodology that we used in working with ALT to really look at the impact of new development across all of Aquidneck Island. And I think this will be really interesting, you know, in comparison with Ron's team and what they looked at, because our team really took more of a demand side approach. We were looking at, you know, when you look out to 2050, what's the demand for new development and what impacts might that have? And Ron's team, in contrast, really took a supply side approach. So when you look at the land, how much development can it support? And, you know, with those two different methodologies, there's no reason they had to align like they did, but the really consistent results really helps to show just how important it is to think about conservation right now. There's a real urgency in terms of the pace of new development and the impacts it could have on the island. And so putting these two studies together shows how much can be supported and how quickly you might hit that cap, which our study showed could easily be by 2050. So our study as a whole really looked at understanding the potential impacts of the future development across the island. So Middletown, Portsmouth, as well as Newport. And like Ron, we took a scenario planning approach, and ours was really focused on looking at two potential stories for the future of the island. And so we thought it would be interesting to really compare and contrast what would happen if things continued along the current route, current development trends, more suburban style development, the current pace. And then if you were to contrast that with scenario 2, but what if the island chose a different path where conservation is prioritized and redevelopment pressures are redirected in different ways? And so today I'll really talk about these two scenarios, some of the numbers that went into them, the assumptions, and then once you play out the scenarios, what that means in terms of different impacts. And Chuck alluded to this in the introduction, but the island's really an interesting place when you look at some of the numbers. So from a population perspective, things have been flat or even slightly declining across the board over the last 30, 35 years. But when you look at development, it's a very different picture. Despite the flat population, development has been increasing and continued. So our team really started with this as the basis. So we looked at the average number of residential units permitted across the island over the past 30 years, and then we projected that forward to 2050. So since 1980, it's been an average of 165 units, and that's really the numbers that we use projected out. The third step of the scenario modeling is really to look at what are those rules that will really guide how the scenario modeling occurs. So this is a matter of identifying the total number of units, the total number of new acres of various land uses from commercial to industrial, as well as new conservation land. And then looking at what those rules are that really guide how it will play out across the board. And so if you were to look at these two, scenario one is the closest to Ron's Middletown study, where it looks at largely keeping zoning the same. You know, one of his scenarios was very similar to that. And then scenario two is really that option about what if we did things differently? What if we instead increased the number of slightly more dense housing developments, so around 10 to 14 units an acre? What if that were slightly higher across the three towns? What might that mean in terms of future impacts? So with these studies, the two scenarios have that same number of underlying housing units. It's just differences in what the housing units look like. And then the constraints are different as well. So scenario one really follows existing zoning. It really limits new redevelopment. And scenario two, on the other hand, is really looking at what if you were to prioritize conservation, more similar to Ron's scenario that looked at the watershed protection area. What if you were to exclude development there? What if you were to really increase conservation more than in business as usual? And so I can just draw your attention. So Middletown, in our study, we were looking at a demand out to 2050 of about 1,530 units. So that's about 10% less, you know, within 10% of that excluding marginal lot scenario that Ron's team looked at. So in the ballpark. And then the next step of the scenarios is really to take those rules, take those number of new units, and then allocate them across available land. And so to do this, we start by taking a look at existing constraints and existing opportunities when it comes to new development. So you can see here, this is a bird's eye. So we're kind of hovering over West Main Road, looking north on the island. And so you can see here, this is the starting point. So there are some parcels that are not available for new development. Those have the little conservation icons on them. So those are land that's already protected. You can see other lands already developed, whether it's, you know, sort of that retail shopping center in the foreground or, you know, other suburban housing as you look further into the distance. And so this is really the starting point. And so from there, based on those rules, we start to model where new development could go in the two different scenarios. And so this is the results of scenario one. So everything in red that you're seeing in this view is new development. And you can probably guess, just based on the size of these boxes, which ones are residential and which ones are commercial. And so this modeling process is looking at existing zoning. It's looking at sort of attraction factors like where new commercial development may be more attracted to go, all else equal. And it's also looking at where existing land may not be protected. So that golf course that Ron mentioned is in the bottom left corner here. I'm gonna flip back just quickly. You can see golf course. It does not have existing protection. So without more, you know, sort of changing those underlying rules, then it's at risk for new development into the future. So you could see it could hold a number of new housing units there. And then in contrast, if I flip ahead, so you can kind of keep in your mind, you know, lots of red dots sort of distributed across the map. And then in contrast, scenario two has the same number of housing units, but it's taking different formats. So instead of being really dispersed across the board, it's slightly more compact and concentrated. And in this scenario, you can start to see that there's new conservation land that occurs, represented by these sort of leaf icons that are a little bit lemony green. And then you've got redevelopment that occurs in a shopping center here, so more of a town style new development. And you've got a little bit more compact lots, more cluster style when it comes to new suburban neighborhoods. And so across the board, it's really a scenario that shows a much greater promise for conserving scenic views, for conserving water resources, and other important things that make the island what people love about it. And then here, I'm just going to show you the two together, so you can really get a sense of, you know, where the red goes in the different scenarios, where that new development is, and then where the new conservation land is. So same number of units, but really different futures for the island. And so then the final step of the scenario modeling, like Ron, we modeled what these different scenarios would mean in terms of impacts on things like water resources, on risk due to flooding today and into the future, and then also looking at a few other topics that I'll touch on today. So after running the scenarios, looking at the results, there are really three key findings that I wanted to highlight for y'all today. And so to do that, we'll actually take a trip together down to the island. And I know everyone may be tired of sitting inside and going on Zoom calls, so I hope that you're ready for a little break. So what we're going to do is visit 3 different places in the scenario. So you'll get to go to Aquidneck Island, and you'll get to fast forward to 2050 in the next few minutes. So we'll start on one of the more distant parts of this view. We'll look at a current scenic view and look at what happens to that in scenario 1. And the second part of our trip will then travel south to an existing suburban style shopping center. And then finally, we'll head back north and take a look at what happens around some of the drinking water reservoirs on the island to kind of, you know, understand what happens in each of these places, because they're really similar to what happens in many other places across the island. So first, we'll start on East Main Road. And most of y'all that have been to Aquidneck Island probably recognize this view. So driving north on East Main Road, you look out over the right and you see this really spectacular vista, open field, you know, glimmer of water in the distance. And this is one of those places on the island that, you know, is a beautiful scenic view, but has no underlying protection from future development. And due to land pressures, sites like this could become new residential subdivisions. And so our modeling really helped to understand, what does this mean from many different perspectives when it comes to scenic resources, when it comes to agricultural land, and just what it could mean for quality of life and how people enjoy the island today. So this lot, like many that's not protected, really undergoes development pressures out until 2050, and it ends up having significant negative resources, negative impacts on many different categories. That's the first important takeaway, is that by 2050, in scenario 1, which is trends continue, all of the island's unprotected open space will be consumed. And so even though it's the same number of new housing units that are accommodated, scenario 1 takes 3,000 new acres to fit all those new homes, whereas scenario 2 only needs 900 acres. So you can imagine how many different, how much difference that really makes when it comes to these impacts, much less land conservation in scenario 2. And when it comes to agricultural resources, unsurprisingly, scenario 1 really takes a toll on the remaining farmland on the island. So 76% of today's unprotected farmland is developed in scenario 1. And you can contrast that with scenario 2, where only 22% is developed, 41% is conserved, and then 38% remains. And so then our next stop on the tour, we're gonna hop over to scenario number 2, and we're gonna head down to the shopping center. And some of you may recognize this view, like many suburban shopping centers. And so this is really an opportunity when you look at scenario 2 and the opportunities for more town center style development. This is really a spot on the island that could fit a lot of the criteria for slightly increased density to make sense. It's important to note that we're talking about, you know, a level of density more townhouse style, you know, 2 to 3 stories, something that really makes sense and fits in well with the character of the island. When we say high density, it's something like townhouses. It's not very high at all. And so you can see the benefits of this style of development really are many when it comes to thinking about conservation priorities as well as others. And one of the interesting things for our team was, you know, when you look at the current trajectory, so everywhere in red on these two maps is new development. And you can see how much more red there is here on scenario 1 on the left compared to scenario 2 on the right. And remember, that's the same number of new housing units, but look at how much more space it takes up over here on the left. And so on the right, what you also start to see are these dark green dots. And those are all open space that remains even though it's not conserved. So in scenario 1, all of the open space is developed with a few new conservation tracks added to the mix. But in scenario 2, you're actually able to conserve even more conservation land on top of efforts, sort of by default, because there's less pressure for more land being developed. So in this way, smart growth is really a friend of conservation. By adopting smart growth practices, by adopting slightly more levels of mixed use development, you're really able to see significant impacts when it comes to protecting open space. And one of the other benefits when it comes to smart growth style development patterns is on the fiscal health side. So we modeled out the projected annual tax revenue increases for these two scenarios in the 3 towns on the island to really understand what that financial impact could be. And you can see over here, the average property tax revenue for more suburban style residential is about $15,000 per acre. And you compare that in a mixed use style development where it's 12 times higher, or about almost $200,000 an acre. So overall, when you add it all up across the towns on the island, it's about an 8.4% increase in island-wide tax revenue in scenario 2 relative to scenario 1. So smart growth is a friend of conservation, and it's also a friend of fiscal health when it comes to property tax revenue. And so our third stop on our tour is to head up to look around the reservoirs in the middle of Aquidneck Island. And you can see here as we zoom in just how much more new development occurs in scenario 1. It's quite striking. You know, there's some conservation land around the scenarios today, but there are other areas that don't have that same level of protection. And so as a result, we found very similar results to Ron, but both scenarios increase the amount of impervious surface, the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, and suspended solids. But scenario 1 has even more negative impacts on the island's water resources. So greater pollutant loading, greater impervious surfaces. You can see in many cases it's you know, nearly double or even more in some cases, like phosphorus, for example. And so this really speaks to the importance, even though these bodies of water are in Portsmouth, it's really important for the island as a whole to work together, because development across the island is really draining into these water bodies and has impacts on the island's water resources as a whole. So that's really the third important underlying takeaway, is just how important it is for the island to work together on these issues. For the island to preserve the scenic character that everyone loves today, it's really going to take a team effort. Conservation side, zoning side, all these different areas need to work together and really make sure that it's able to help protect what everyone loves. So those 3 important takeaways that we found was, number 1, it's really important to act now and really choose the course that the island wants to be on. The island will run out of space by 2050 at the current rate of development. Number 2, the current development trends are more harmful to the island's waters and provide lower per acre tax-based revenue. So in this way, smart growth really has a lot of benefits to offer as an alternative path for the island. And number 3, it's really important to work together. Regional planning is really critical, because a lot of these impacts to drinking water, to view sheds, they really cross jurisdiction lines. And together, that's really the way to choose the path for the island and work towards it as a team. And so I'm happy to answer questions today, or if you have follow-up questions, feel free to shoot me an email.
Jill, thank you very much. So many times when people are looking at kind of the quality of life question, it's always in terms of, do we develop or do we conserve? And it really shouldn't be framed that way, because what we found through our assessment is that proper land use planning and development can actually be a friend of land conservation. And it doesn't have to be contrary to land conservation. So I just want to ask the panel, kind of, how is it that you see land use planning and implementation supporting land conservation and the other way around?
I mean, Jill highlighted this, but something I'm still find striking about the two scenario analysis is just that the smart growth, when you look parcel by parcel and you really get into the granular data, you're not turning parts of Middletown into Manhattan. Like Jill said, it's just very reasonable upzoning, very reasonable redevelopment in certain areas into mixed use. And the difference between 900 and 3,000 acres on Aquidneck Island is huge. Just for folks who don't know, the whole island is about 25,000 acres. So 2,100 acres saved while accomplishing the same exact housing demand is really huge for the island. And I think that's the piece of the analysis that, to me, was really great, is that we use the same housing demand in each scenario and accomplished that while saving more land and having more open space in scenario 2.
I would just echo that, Alex. I think the town is going to be able to take this information from the study we did as well as your study and show that with some, I'll call it tweaking, there's an ability to have a real impact. It does take some decision making and maybe some political will to talk about maybe upzoning portions of the town through implementation of the mixed use ordinance or other zoning changes. But that opportunity to accommodate additional development demand in areas of town that are already developed, I think is something that hasn't been talked about all that much here in Middletown yet, but this is going to be a good opportunity to get that conversation started.
The other thing that struck me, Ron, is with your assessment, you looked at how different ordinances could affect your development. And it occurred to me that, like, if you stop development in the watershed protection district, how much development that would actually stop. But I'm thinking from a legal standpoint, it's very difficult to take that development right out of all that watershed protection land and not look at a lot of litigation. And it brought to mind the fact that through conservation, because we purchased conservation easements, it's a way that we can still monetize the protection of that land in the watershed protection district. So I think that's the other side of it. That's how conservation can really help the innovative zoning and development of the community to create that perfect balance.
Absolutely, I totally agree. That idea of prohibiting development in Zone 1, that's going to be a tough conversation to have.
Right.
But even downzoning in the R40 and R60 districts, you're affecting someone's their anticipated development potential, and there'll be discussions about property rights and property values. So yeah, I agree. It certainly would be better if we're able to conserve those properties through purchase of development rights. But we'll also continue to look at these regulatory alternatives.
Right. Anything else on that? So I wanted to roll into rolling out, if you will, a development impact analysis in an understandable and relevant manner, which has become quite challenging in the period of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. We, ALT and Sasaki, have had one public meeting back in November to a really engaged crowd of people. It was quite impressive how many people showed up for it. And we had lessons that we learned from that. And Jill, give me some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure thing. So we shared the results of this analysis back in November to a packed room, and it was really interesting just to hear people's take on the matter. we had a few different activities where people could tell us places they loved, and then, they could see what happened to them in the various scenarios. And we also did some public polling as part of the presentation to understand, were people concerned or not? And it was really striking. So 89% of respondents so it was 88 people total that participated. So they were very concerned about the impacts of development if trends continue, and 88% thought it was very important to protect the island's farmland and natural resources. So for us, it was really strong support for the need to really do things differently and think more about a path that's like scenario 2. I was really struck just by how interested the audience was and how they could personally make a difference. People were asking, how do I change zoning? How do I really help make scenario 2 more likely? So just a lot of interest and passion for the topic.
Great. One of the interesting things to me was in the discussions of mixed use development, how not everyone views like a town center, and we showed renderings of a potential town center. Not everyone viewed that in a positive light. So it's interesting when you come up with what you believe is a positive view towards the future. Not everyone always agrees with that interpretation. So, I mean, it's just interesting to see how people look at new things, new zoning, innovative, smart growth. Alex, what do you think about it?
Yeah, and even in that case, we still had 2/3 support for the smart growth scenario, which is a pretty strong veto-proof majority, right? I mean, the other thing I think is important, and so far we've done a number of things to accomplish this, is just to share the information in different ways. People absorb information in different ways. Not everyone's a planner and wants to look through a 100-page document for the methods. And things we have done at ALT so far, we worked with Suzaki on just a 2-page giveaway that just really gave highlights of the presentation someone could look at in a couple minutes and get the gist of it. We had the public meeting. I think the renderings and the bird's eyes that Jill shows really make it relatable to people who need more visual stimulation, aren't going to read a whole report. And then we also put together, coming from the nonprofit world, and we're trying to raise money for land, a video that takes pieces of this presentation that Jill just gave, and it sort of intertwines it with interviews about some of the work that's been done. And I'll share a link to that. And that was, I think, a nice way we were able to share the results and make the case for why this is important in the work we've done in the past. So trying to mix up the way you disseminate the information depending on your audience, I think, is really important in unrolling these analyses.
So Ron, you've really just started unrolling, and you've done so to your planning board, which is kind of your most expertise audience, I guess I would say. How did that go?
It went well. Again, you're right. It was a more technical presentation. It took quite a bit of time during a special meeting to go through the entire report, lots of numbers and discussions of the analysis that were done. So not necessarily the model of presentation that we want to use when we're going out to the general public to talk about the highlights of the report, and then the next conversation about how we get to policy changes and regulatory changes. We'll be working on that over the next month or so before the town council meeting to craft a presentation that is user-friendly. I may use your presentation as a model to help me put something together. Yeah, but we'll definitely have to eliminate a lot of the technical discussion, if for no other reason because of the time limitations that we'll have, and have something that's going to be easily digested by the public.
Yeah, in our presentation, it was interesting to me. I mean, I think the presentation was at the right level, but even with that, when you're doing a general public, general information about a technical subject, you want to keep it fairly high level, but even with that, the survey showed 17% of the people felt like they needed more information. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's hard to find that right balance. But it, you know, it's interesting how you definitely have to know who your audience is and what level to talk about it. And so, Jill, can you just give us a little bit of your experience, how you think the pandemic has changed any of this? I mean, we think it has on the conservation side, and I'd have Alex talk about that, but just kind of your experiences, how people are viewing higher density and mixed use now with COVID.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think, you know, COVID's really shifting opinions both on density, but also just on the importance of open space and how important it is to have open space that you can walk to or otherwise get to without too much trouble close to your house. So we've really seen increased demand for open space really close by, and types of open space that let people go, you know, with their family or just by themselves, and allow space for social distancing. So for example, families are really looking for opportunities that aren't playgrounds necessarily, but, you know, more open spaces that kids can run around in and play more by themselves. So we're seeing these shifts in the types of open space that people are looking for, and just increased demand across the board. And then in parallel with that, it's really shedding light onto the existing disparities in our country when it comes to open space access. Not all neighborhoods have open space right close to homes. And a lot of those neighborhoods are the same ones that are being impacted especially hard when it comes to COVID. So this is really a call to action for all of us to, you know, find ways to really increase conservation, to increase green space, and really make it accessible to everyone.
Alex, talk about our experience, ALT's experience during COVID with open space use.
Yeah, I mean, we actually are able to put data to that because we have trail counters out on our trails, and a couple of them we've had up in a time period, March to July of this year, can compare it to last year, obviously pre-pandemic, and we've seen 3 times the use on the trails in the same period, you know, with the pandemic going on. So, and we have seen people have been safe using the trails, but there's definitely higher use, you know, in recreation areas, particularly, at least we can quantify our trail systems.
And Alex, what have y'all seen when it comes to development pressures on the island in the past few months?
Yeah, so we, this is anecdotal too, but we weren't really sure what to expect, but we're seeing a lot of folks who are escaping areas like New York wanting to build and have a, you know, a house on Aquidneck Island now. So I think, you know, and Chuck, I don't know if you would agree, but we seem to be seeing higher development pressure even with an uncertain economy on Aquidneck Island.
Absolutely. We really expected that the pandemic was going to gut the residential real estate market, and it has gone so far the other way. Appraisals that we've gotten recently, the property sells for 20 or 30% over the appraised value. So it's like you can't even keep up with what the value of land is anymore.
Wow.
It's amazing. So let's talk about next steps in the development impact analysis work. ALT is in the process of trying to roll out our plan, our assessment to each of the councils. We have not yet been able to do that because we were hoping we'd get back to a public meeting to do so. I think we now have to probably think about going back to doing something on Zoom with them, but we have not yet done that. Alex, just talk about how you kind of see the work that we would do going forward with the next step using this assessment.
Yeah, so going back to sort of our initial 3 audiences, Chuck just mentioned going to the Chuck and our development director and some board members are reaching out to donors to try to, explain the report and the need for funding for land conservation. And the last audience is, just the general population of Aquidneck Island. And actually we've had discussions with GrowSmart on presenting, doing land use workshops, educational workshops on how people can get involved. There's interesting, at our public meeting we had a lot of energy, but there's sort of a wall between people having energy and caring about these issues and knowing how to participate to get change done. I mean, people know they have to show up to a zoning meeting, but they don't know when they can talk or what's appropriate to say and the whole process. So the hope is that working with GrowSmart, we can sort of educate folks on how to do that. And I'm sure that's common in most communities. Even with passion, it's sort of unclear how you can have your voice be heard. So that's what we're looking at in the near future.
So guys, we're kind of running over, so I just wanted to get your takeaways from the whole process of doing a development impact assessment. Ron, why don't you start?
So again, we're kind of in the middle of the process here, so I'll have more takeaways when we actually have that public discussion. I think so far, the interest of the planning board in getting this project done is a good thing. They've really taken the bull by the horns to try to address the concerns that they've heard about. They went to the town council, requested the money to do the study. Very, very proactive. So I'm encouraged by that. And that leads me to think that there'll be some good results coming out of the discussion of implementation and adopting some of the policies that are talked about in the study.
Hey guys, I'm going to ask for takeaways in your answers to questions so that we have time to get to questions. CJ, do you want to bring us some questions?
I would love to. Thanks, Chuck. So we have a lot of questions. I'll say off the bat, we'll try to get to, I see some opportunities to combine a couple, so I'm going to do that as I can. And I'll just say right now to our audience, if we don't get to your question and you would really like it answered, please feel free to email me and I can pass it along to our panelists. But let's answer a few of these. So one is, what is the role that the private sector can take to ensure that conservation goals are met? And what incentives can be given for smart growth?
Anyone?
Well, I can talk to at least the incentives question. In our mixed use ordinance that I mentioned, we do have some incentives to promote development of affordable housing, and the incentive is increased density within those mixed use developments, which again, hopefully creates that supply that pulls demand away from the undeveloped portions of town. So, it's a small incentive, but it's a starting point. And, perhaps we'll be looking at beefing up incentives going forward through implementation of the recommendations.
I think as to the kind of the implementation of conservation and what the public can do, I mean, I think it's advocacy for conservation, both at the municipal level with town governments, but also with your neighbors, and what both, conservation, but what they also can do to improve the watersheds and what they do on their lawns. I mean, it can be a lot of different things, but I think it all stems to advocacy for making this a better place.
Excellent. So we had a couple of questions that were concerned about affordable housing. I'll kind of combine them here. Is there a way to balance conservation with ensuring existing residents can continue to afford to live on the island, and so the island doesn't become a mecca for only the more affluent? And how does this build-out analysis help Aquidneck Island and specifically Middletown address affordable housing?
Alex, do you want to just talk about the work of HES and the concept of a community benefits agreement?
You're muted.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, I mean, we've been working in Newport, which obviously has a big development project in the North End in process, or the North End urban plan is in process, about just making sure there's community engagement in that process. And one practice that's been used in other places of what's called the community benefit agreement, which is as part of a development project that the developer works with the community to do things that the community wants. Maybe it's a publicly accessible park as part of the development, or maybe it's a section of the development includes affordable housing, but it's really driven by engagement with the community and what they see as the need around that development project or as part of that development project. So we've been just working with the health equity zone in Newport to try to promote that concept.
Bill, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really glad that the question came up, because it's a really important one when it comes to how you balance all these different factors. I mean, I think, the analysis, both Middletown's and ours really shows how potent development pressures on the island are today. And it's just so important to think about affordable housing in tandem with conservation efforts. They really can go hand in hand. But it's something that, it's really important to take those proactive, concrete steps and not just hope that it happens along the way.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. A couple questions. We're also concerned with regional cooperation. How important is regional cooperation on the island in working towards a scenario 2 versus a scenario 1? And what can the 3 municipalities do together to work towards more land conservation?
I could take the first part of the question. I don't know if someone else wants to take the second half. I think it's absolutely critical, because when you look at these issues like view sheds and like water, I mean, water doesn't know where those town boundaries are. It's just going to keep flowing like it would anyway. And so when you look at the kinds of issues that the community cares about, things like traffic, water resources, they're all things that go across town lines. So it's absolutely critical to have the future that the island wants to really do it as a team across all 3 towns.
Ron, do you have thoughts?
I think I mean, it's obvious, but each town is going to have its own interests and is going to want to retain control over land use decisions. I mean, that's just the way it is. But that being said, I think the land trust can probably serve the role of being that regional organization that herds the 3 cats and gets us hopefully moving in the same direction in conservation. Chuck, as you mentioned, Middletown and Portsmouth and Newport, for that matter, have been very supportive of land conservation and the work that the Land Trust does. And I think that just needs to continue.
Yeah. I think that's most striking on the water resources issue. So our water reservoirs are in Middletown and Portsmouth, and Newport controls them. So it really is a completely regional issue when it comes to water here.
Excellent. Let's see. So here's another one. We hope that we know that demand for suburban style housing is likely to continue on trend. Is there evidence of the same level of demand for the denser options Jill shared in scenario 2?
That's a good question. So our polling question shows that 2/3 of the 88 people in the room would prefer the more scenario 2 style development. And then others were looking for more information on it. So, I mean, it's anecdotal. I mean, I think across the board, when you look at, groups like ULI and others that survey potential consumers, there's increasing shifts to more compact style development, more townhouse style. So there's various resources that you can look at to see. I don't know sort of hard data for Aquidneck Island, but at least anecdotally, it seems like there would be demand to support it.
I would just say that a couple of developments that have happened over the last year or two, condo townhouse style developments, again, it's anecdotal, but those have sold like hotcakes. They did sell immediately, and I'm sure it has to do with the affordability of those units versus what you can get in a single family house. But that's all I can say is that they've been selling like crazy.
Well, and on the inverse side of that, I think Middletown is kind of an interesting case study of a community that has fought back against traditional trend style subdivision development. And they have effectively stopped a number of developments because they were within a watershed or they had other issues with those properties. And that you don't always see that kind of engagement. And, you know, we just want to foster that. It was quite amazing to see a group of residents get together and actually hire engineers to make their case. I mean, that you just don't see very often. And I thought it was a really great story that they were able to do that.
So to build off that last question a little bit, wondering from the developer's perspective, do they have potential to make more money in scenario 2 versus a scenario 1 build out?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you'd have to look at each parcel one by one, but the densities, I mean, on a per acre basis, the returns would be higher in scenario 2.
All right, easy enough. So this one's a little long, but I think we have a couple minutes we can address this one. So for the land trust, as large retail and big box development continue to dwindle, do you foresee opportunities to buy up future abandoned commercial and retail lots and return them to nature? Maybe envisioning a future where there are several vacant big box stores along 114, where lots could be rezoned or purchased and returned to open space. So do you foresee this as a possibility, or do you think there would be more pressure to convert them to mixed use residential for future tax revenue?
To me, I mean, I look at that and see that's a perfect opportunity for redevelopment to satisfy the housing need into a mixed use development. And maybe there's a component of that development that includes open space for sure, but it almost seems more efficient to convert that into, you know, apartments and any of the things you would have in a mixed use development than, you know, turn that into open space and develop elsewhere, you know.
Especially because all the infrastructure has been built up around it. I agree with what Alex has said, but we will always be advocating for an open space component within those mixed use developments.
And kind of building off of what you just mentioned, Chuck, as far as the infrastructure, we have this question, given the apparently clear benefits of implementing scenario 2, what are the impediments, maybe political or legal, to changing existing systems such as regulatory, property tax, or utilities to yield scenario 2?
So Ron, do you have thoughts on that from a municipal standpoint? I mean, are there obstacles in implementing a mixed use ordinance?
Yes, I think that there's the drafting of the ordinance was not necessarily easy. I think there's concern from some folks, and Chuck, you alluded to this, about increasing development density in parts of town and the impacts it has on the existing residents in those areas. The implementation of the ordinance, our mixed use ordinance, has been slow, meaning that we haven't seen applications come flying through the door yet for development of those mixed use opportunities. And it may be that, you know, again, you're drafting an ordinance by committee. The ordinance isn't going to be perfect. And maybe the ordinance needs to be revised in some way to make it more attractive to developers. That we've heard from development attorneys is that they feel their clients aren't interested because the supposed benefits of developing mixed use project do not make sense for them for whatever reason. So yeah, it's still a work in progress, and we'll be reviewing the ordinance as we go forward.
Great. Okay, so I think this will be our last question. So how does regional cooperation really happen? Are there organizations, commissions, et cetera, that the towns could turn to support this? I know, I mean, ALT obviously is going to be one of those, but how do you see that being facilitated?
I mean, quite frankly, right now, our greatest success is just dealing with each community on its own. And when we can do that and explain kind of the consequences of what Middletown does on Newport, on what Portsmouth does on Middletown, but to actually work on some kind of collaboration between those three communities is, you know, we're kind of too busy with the mission on the ground to take that on. We have not taken that on as our mission. There is an organization called the Aquidneck Island Planning Commission, which actually has that as a mission to act as a regional planning commission for the island. And they've had, you know, it hasn't been easy. It's a tough, very tough thing to do in a New England community to try to bring three municipalities together to work collaboratively on even something as easy as environmental issues, where you would think that that would just come naturally. So it hasn't been easy, but they are trying to do that.
Right. All right. Yeah, definitely an ongoing effort in the cooperation department. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. Just want to thank you one more time. Say thank you one more time to our wonderful panelists here. Thank you guys so much. Definitely learned a lot. Thank you to everybody who's attended today. Again, if you have any more questions, you can please feel free to write to me, and I will forward them along to these folks as needed. So thanks for being with us today. Hope to see you next week and for more Wednesday webinars, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye.